Hey everyone, welcome back to our Love, Treachery, and Other Terrors Read Aloud. Today we're going to be reading chapters 26 and 27. We're almost at the end, so let's plow on forward. Chapter 26, A Familiar Face. I now know how you survived the siege of 782, Florian commented. He was sitting on the edge of a fountain in one of Lysandria's 7 forums. He had made the mistake of pulling a bread crust from his bag and was currently fighting off a mob of pigeons. You feasted on these damned birds. Alexander grinned at Florian's frustration. The three had found an apartment in the heart of the city, and each day they would sell the goods they had bought in a different marketplace. In doing so, they were able to get a clear picture of the state of affairs. That day they were stationed in the largest of these forums, the Forum of St. Valerian. It divided the city proper from the palace walls. Filbert and Florian insisted on calling it a square, even though it was more of a big half-circle. They called all the marketplaces squares, which annoyed Alexander. They must have realized it, too, because they went out of their way to use the word square around him as much as possible. On the northern end stood Calathea's great cathedral, and on the southern end was the entrance to the amphitheater. The square was centered by a dangerously pointy obelisk that Lysander the Conqueror had borrowed from Egypt over 1,000 years ago. And directly parallel to that, up a broad flight of stone steps, stood the golden gate that opened onto the palace grounds. It was a strange thing, experiencing the city through the eyes of a merchant, talking to the common folk, seeing the golden gates from the outside. The nobles in the palace were always talking about the people, asking what the people want and what is best for the people. Now that Alexander was one of the people, he was beginning to think that the noble class knew nothing about them at all. As time passed, Alexander became the talk of the city. For one thing, everyone thought he looked vaguely familiar. His customers would often ask if they had met him before. Alexander would respond with a smile and a shrug and say it was certainly possible, then change the subject. The other thing that was strange about him was that he wasn't worried about the recent increase in the number of cultic immigrants. When it came up in conversation, he would say, "Of course they're coming here. Why would you want to live in Caltahaven when you could live in Calathea?" "I don't like it," one particularly bitter customer complained. "What's to stop them from rising up and seizing power?" "Oh, I doubt the gods would allow that," Alexander replied innocently. "It's a wonder the gods haven't purged them from the earth, the way they blaspheme." "It could be that the gods are waiting for the last of them to arrive," Alexander theorized, "so they can smite them all at once. Or it could be that what the cults say about our gods is true." What the cult said was that the gods were not gods at all, just deceptive beings using their magic to instill fear in the hearts of their subjects. They went so far as to say that these beings were actually incapable of killing humans, or even of hurting them without hurting themselves. Such irreverence was expected of cults, but the fact that Alexander entertained their ideas was very strange. When the people pressed him on this, he would say, "Think about it. Have you ever seen them kill anyone themselves?" Some of the locals said they had friends who had seen the gods smite people. One swore they killed a distant cousin of his with a lightning bolt, but hadn't actually witnessed the incident himself. The longer Alexander stayed in the city, the more the people's suspicion of him waned. Those who got to know him found him intelligent and pleasant. He seemed very concerned about how people were faring under the rule of their new gods, and would quietly seek out those who had suffered on their account, and offer his assistance. Over time, his neighbors came to respect him, even if he was unusual. Word of his wisdom and generosity spread. The more people grew to like him, the more they wanted him to stop speaking ill of the gods. They told him that if he continued spouting blasphemies, the gods would retaliate. To this Alexander smiled and replied, "I expect nothing less." After about 6 weeks, Alexander was standing by his cart in the marketplace. Filbert was speaking to a group of cults a few stalls away, glancing in Alexander's direction once in a while to ensure he wasn't doing anything dangerous, like going for a walk by himself. Florian had gone back to Elithu. He was going to meet one of the knights he had stationed there with the hope of learning how Demera was faring. The square was never empty, but the crowd was light that particular morning. Alexander found himself in the unfortunate position of speaking to his neighbor Linus. Linus was also a merchant. He sold fabric. He had 20 years of experience doing so, and made this known to Alexander every time they happened to set up shop in the same part of town. That particular day, he took it upon himself to give Alexander advice, telling him he needed to be bolder and draw people in. Alexander was nodding politely while internally begging God for deliverance. And deliverance came with the sound of galloping paws. Alexander turned just in time to see a large black dog leaping for him. The next thing he knew, he was lying on his back, shielding his face from aggressive licking. The forepaws of the great beast danced up and down on his chest while the tail whipped violently back and forth. "Lonzo!" Alexander blurted. Then he heard another voice cry the same name. He pushed the old dog off so he could stand. When he saw Ilona racing across the square after the dogs, mumbling cultic swear words under her breath, he struggled to suppress his delight. "Sorry, sorry," she called as she darted through the crowd. "Are you all right?" Linus exclaimed as Alexander tried to keep the animal from knocking him over again. He had never seen the old dog so alive. "I'm all right," he promised, and then frowned at Ilona as she looped a rope around Lonzo's neck and tried to pull him away. "Control that animal, will you?" Alexander grumbled. Ilona bit her lip. "Sorry, I'm sorry." Alexander wanted so badly to ask her how Lonzo managed the trip, but restrained himself. A few passers-by stopped to see what was happening. Some asked if Alexander was all right while shooting Ilona dark looks. Alexander assured them he was fine, while Ilona struggled to pull Lonzo away. Then something happened which startled Alexander so much he jumped backward, crashing into his cart. Lonzo barked. It was a sound that started in a low growl and grew into a harsh and echoing snap. Alexander had never heard the old dog make any noise other than a sad whimper. Lonzo kept barking as he struggled against Ilona. "Get that vicious animal out of here before I call the guard," Linus exclaimed. Alexander heard another voice say they had already called the guard. Then the spectators started showering Ilona in a hail of insults and telling her to go back to Caltahaven. His countrymen had said similar things to Filbert and Florian, but for some reason, seeing them speak to Ilona like that filled him with a burning rage. She had to leave, before he did something stupid and put their whole plan in jeopardy. Alexander locked eyes with Ilona and mouthed, "You have no money. You have nothing." As he was doing so, he found a loose thread on the seam at his shoulder and pulled it down so it made a hole. Ilona furrowed her brow. "Look what your dog has done," Alexander exclaimed, and the crowd looked from Ilona back to him. "You must pay me for my tunic." Realization dawned in her eyes. "No money, sir," she replied. "Nothing, nothing." Alexander tried not to smile at her purposefully broken Greek. "Then I'll take the dog," he demanded. Relief washed over her. She mouthed, "Thank you." Alexander noticed Egbert trotting up behind her. She must have broken away from him shortly after Lonzo broke away from her. The crowd cried out in agreement with Alexander. Ilona furrowed her brow, her eyes moistened. "Yes, anything, sir. No trouble, sir," she said. Ilona gave Alexander the rope, and the old dog sat down quietly beside him. His tail thumped against the cobblestone, and his red tongue hung from his mouth. A guard shoved his way through the ring of spectators and scowled at Ilona and Egbert. Alexander noticed Filbert resting his hand on the hilt of his dagger. "What's going on here?" the guard demanded. "Nothing, sir," Alexander replied. "Just a minor disagreement, but we've settled things." "Good," the guard answered. Then looking at Egbert, he added, "Take your daughter home before she causes any more trouble." "No trouble," Ilona insisted. "We go." As she turned away, she looked over her shoulder at Alexander. Amusement glimmered in her eyes. It took all of Alexander's strength not to smile. "Do I know you?" the guard asked. Alexander didn't recognize the man. "Of course you know him. Everybody knows him," Linus exclaimed, throwing an unwelcome arm around Alexander's shoulder. "This is Alexander Freeman." Alexander took a step away from Linus. He was one of those touchy people Alexander couldn't stand. "I know who he looks like," the guard realized. "He looks just like the young king, Alexander." "People say that all the time," Alexander laughed. "Who?" Linus asked. "Remember, right after Basil and before Fausta, there was that kid?" "Was there? I don't remember that at all," Linus replied. "Perhaps you were abroad at the time," Alexander suggested, rubbing Lonzo's head with his free hand. The guard was scrutinizing Alexander's face. "Look at me," he ordered. Alexander did so, and the guard brushed his hair aside and stared at his forehead. Alexander let him look just long enough to see that he did not have a scar above his eyebrow, and then leaned away from his hand. The guard shrugged. Then he bid the merchants good day and continued patrolling. Fausta stood in the middle of the street just outside the palace. The crowd pressed close around her. Without seeing her, Jace and Acacia were standing on either side of her, themselves invisible to passers-by. "Notice anything unusual, my queen?" Acacia asked. Fausta did notice something unusual. The street was swarming with barbarians, living, working, and going about their business as if they were native Calatheans. She had fallen into the habit of playing stupid in the presence of her captors, so in response to Acacia's suggestion, she shrugged. "You aren't even slightly concerned about all these cults?" She was very concerned. She would have stopped allowing them in long ago if the twins hadn't imprisoned her. "Should I be?" she asked. "The Senate has been begging us to get rid of them for months now," Jace answered. "I assume that's why you haven't," Fausta answered dryly. "Of course," Acacia answered. "I just love watching those ornery old men squirm." Every now and then the twins said something like that, something that made Fausta think they weren't completely evil. "Also, I am very curious to see what comes of all this," Acacia added. Fausta furrowed her brow. So the twins weren't responsible for this cultic invasion. They were simply allowing it to happen. Fausta's head started hurting as she wondered why. They had complete control over Calathea. Didn't they want to protect what was theirs? Perhaps they hoped to conquer Caltahaven also? She wondered why they wouldn't want to conquer Caltahaven of all places. She didn't know what motivated them. They were almost like heartless little children, destroying things simply for the fun of it. They watched the cults with a sparkle in their eyes, like they just received a shiny new plaything. "What should we do with them, sister?" Jace asked. "I say we leave them be," Acacia smiled. "Supposing they do start fighting with the Calatheans, who do you think would win?" "The cults, definitely," Jace replied. "I disagree. The Calatheans are a proud people with thousands of years of history and culture to preserve. They've been victorious against greater enemies before." "But we've broken them," Jace answered. "They'd all be gone now, if I hadn't put a stop to their leaving." "In all honesty," Acacia answered, "I am getting a bit tired of Calathea, so I'll make a bet with you." "Yes?" "If fighting breaks out and the cults are victorious, I'll let you decide what we do next." "I want to steal Maduri's hourglass again," Jace suggested, "so we can go back in time and find out what happened while we were in prison." Fausta wondered what Maduri's hourglass was. "Ugh, why?" Acacia sighed. "We already know what happened." "But we didn't see it happen," Jace replied. "Fine," Acacia agreed. "But if the Calatheans are victorious, you have to do whatever I say. No arguments. None whatsoever." Fausta hated both of them. Her kingdom, her people, everything her ancestors fought for and died for, were nothing more than game pieces in their hands. Oh, if it were in her power, she'd have their tongues cut out and imprison them in those bottles again. Then they could spend eternity trapped in their own minds. She smiled slightly as she imagined the horror of it. She noticed something that jerked her from her fantasy. A Calathean merchant, walking through the street with a large black dog trailing after him. He was calling out to someone in Celtic. He was older, and he walked with his back straight and his head high, and spoke with a confidence she'd never seen in him. Nonetheless, she was sure it was Alexander. As soon as she realized who it was, she looked down at her feet. Not a moment too soon, she suddenly felt the twins looking at her. "What did you see?" Acacia demanded. It would be useless to deny that she saw something. Even when standing at a short distance, they could sense the slightest shift in her. They noticed when her breathing changed or her heartbeat quickened. It was like they could read her mind, though she had managed to conceal enough from them that she knew they couldn't. She blurted the first name that came to her head that wasn't Alexander. "Tamara." How did she escape?" Acacia wondered. "And why did you betray her so easily?" Jace added. "That's no mystery," Acacia stated. "Fausta has no qualms about treachery." After seeing Alexander, those words were like a knife in her heart. The twins were both looking toward the place where she had seen him, but to her relief, he had disappeared in the crowd. "Are you going to tell us who you really saw?" Jace pressed. Fosta shot him a cold glare. "You know something, Jace?" Acacia interrupted. "It doesn't matter. I'm sure we will encounter whoever it was soon enough." Chapter 27, The Final Preparations. Alexander was lying on his stomach next to his bed, writing a letter. "Do you know what we need?" he said. Filbert was sitting with his back to a wall, sharpening his dagger. "What's that?" "A table," Alexander answered. Filbert glanced around the room. "Where would we put it?" "We could fit a small one in here." Alexander looked at the words he had written against the rough floor. "I hope Senator Clement can read my handwriting." He reached up and scratched Lonzo's shoulder. The dog had taken over his bed. It had been a week since they were reunited, and the animal had returned to his old ways. During the day, he slept under the cart in the marketplace, and at night he slept next to Alexander. "There was no going back once you contact this Clement fellow," Filbert objected. "I'd say we wait a bit longer." "Every day someone comes closer to recognizing me," Alexander insisted. "If we wait, they'll behead me before we have a chance to denounce the twins." Filbert pointed the dagger at Alexander threateningly. "No one is beheading you, kid, so stop worrying about that." Alexander needed to take his place as king so he could denounce the twins on behalf of his people. For that to happen, he needed the Senate to acknowledge his kingship, and for that to happen, he needed to gain their support. This would have been easy, except that the Senate hated him, and had even before Fosta started poisoning his reputation. Alexander wasn't completely sure why, but he suspected it was because he read everything he signed. Almost 9 months ago, when he was back in his workshop, Alexander explained this dilemma to Ilona. "Not one of them opposed my execution," he recalled. Ida, who had been listening quietly, asked, "Was anyone silent?" One senator had been, Senator Clement, a man who had been in his position for as long as anyone could remember. He was a good friend of his father's, and not usually shy about sharing his opinion. But the night Alexander was condemned, he hadn't said a word. "He's your best chance," Ida explained. "Arrange to meet with him in a secret place and tell him about the twins." So Alexander was writing him a note. He had 3 alternate versions hidden under his bed. He kept second-guessing his wording, or maybe he was just stalling. He was taking an awful chance contacting the man, but he had no choice. Suddenly, Alexander heard the sound of heavy footfall approaching the door. "That's the landlord," Filbert whispered, "coming to collect." Alexander tossed a blanket over Alonzo. He was grateful the dog didn't move around much. They heard the cheerful mumbling of a Celtic folk song, and Florian opened the door. "I'm back," he announced. "So it would seem," Alexander replied, feeling slightly relieved. "Why are you so happy?" Filbert questioned. "Because I've been to see our passengers," Florian explained. "Damara is fully healed. She's doing wonderfully." "Excellent news," Alexander smiled. "What about the others?" "He only cares about Damara," Filbert accused. "While we are staging a coup, he's off chasing women." "I thought Damara was married," Alexander mentioned. "Her husband is dead," Florian grinned. "From the way you're smiling, I'd say you killed him," Filbert grumbled. "He died 8 years ago," Florian defended. "Do you know he took 6 arrows defending Prince Justin? 6! Alexander's heart sank. He wondered how many other heroic souls had died in his brother's drunken skirmishes. "You should have found yourself a wife before the war," Filbert complained. "I would have if you hadn't stolen her from me," Florian retorted. Then Filbert grabbed Florian's throat, and Florian shoved Filbert into the wall, and they would have continued fighting if Alexander hadn't spoken up. "Gentlemen, please, do you want the neighbors complaining again?" Lonzo whimpered at the sound of Alexander's voice, and Florian released his brother. "What was that?" Alexander pulled the blanket off Lonzo. Florian's jaw dropped. "How?" "I have no idea," Alexander shrugged. "I told you, didn't I tell you?" Florian exclaimed. "Not one of my knights is as loyal as Lonzo." He ran across the room and started rubbing the old dog up and down. The tail started thumping, but otherwise the dog didn't move. "What other dog could find me halfway across the world?" Alexander looked back at his letter. As Florian tried to coax Lonzo over to his bed, He read it over and over again. He needed more time. He sighed, folded the letter, and put it with the others. He lay awake that night, mulling over everything they had yet to do. He had managed to push Lonzo over enough so that he could squeeze in beside him. It was tight, but for some reason he was glad to have the old dog with him. There was so much to remember, so much could go wrong. He thought of everything Ida told him before she returned to the war. Each point was critical, yet complex. Or maybe he was just overthinking it and making it complex. He rubbed his aching forehead. First, she reminded him that any fairy that kills a human dies instantly. Second, if a fairy causes a human any physical pain, they will feel the pain in equal measure, though it may not be apparent, as fairies have a higher tolerance for pain. Last, she warned him sternly not to use physical force against the twins. If a human attempts to hurt or kill a fairy, the fairy is free to kill without consequence. Of course, Ilona responded to all Ida's points by asking about every imaginable hypothetical situation, like, if two fairies stab a human, killing him at the exact same time, which will die? Ida's typical response was to roll her eyes and say, really, when would that ever happen? Humor me, Ilona insisted. It would be impossible for both blades to kill the victim at the same time. A fraction of a second would be enough to make the difference, Ida theorized. All right, what if 3 fairies each put a drop of poison into a glass? The amount each contributed was... I'm done with this conversation, Ida interrupted. It could be important, Ilona pressed. Ida rolled her eyes. Since I am not in the business of killing humans, I haven't experimented with the boundaries of this law. I am sure Jason Acacia could offer more insight. Sometimes Alexander wondered if Ilona enjoyed annoying Ida. Of course, Ida was easily annoyed. Thinking of Ilona brought Alexander back to the present. He missed her terribly. It was a strange thing. He'd slept alone for 19 years, but in less than 2 years of marriage, he'd gotten so accustomed to having her beside him, he couldn't sleep without her. He should have been more comfortable with a bed to himself. Not only did Ilona take all the blankets, she also seemed to become entirely knees and elbows at night, unconsciously jabbing his every vulnerable point. Alexander glanced over at the twins. They both seemed to be sound asleep. He thought about slipping away by himself for a bit to clear his head. He tried to do this before, but they always woke up just before he reached the door and insisted on coming with him. Living in close quarters was driving Alexander insane. Then again, he probably went insane long before his journey, around the time he agreed to Ilona's plan. The poison was working against the gods. It seemed every day Alexander heard murmurs in the marketplace, snippets of conversation. Do you think it's true? What would happen if we resisted? Why should we submit to their cruelty? Though there was much talk about the limits to the twins' power, until someone was brave enough to confront the gods and test the theory, no one was likely to resist them. Alexander had to make his move. He reached under his bed and found the 3 letters. He read through each of them over and over, trying to determine which he hated least. All right, end of chapter. Next time, Alexander is going to meet the twins, and some stuff's going to happen. So, I will see you then.